Hello, and welcome to Meenah's Tirith, the podcast where we explore Tolkien's world and answer questions from you. My name is Meenah.
And this is Brian.
This is Season 2, Episode 2 of the podcast. Welcome back, listeners, and hello to those who are new. In today's episode, I will share my thoughts on the first 3 episodes of Rings of Power Season 2.
Okay. All right. Cool. Well, this is very exciting. We've waited a long time for these episodes to come out. So, what do you think so far about Season 2?
It's going sort of okay until Episode 3. When we got to Episode 3, I was dying inside. I couldn't bear to finish. In fact, I had to stop 4 to 5 times and then take a break and then go back and watch it again where I left off. It was kind of painful to get through.
Yeah, I fell asleep pretty quickly. And it's probably because you've read all of the books, and it doesn't seem like the series is sticking to the original works like the Silmarillion, the Hobbits, the Lord of the Rings, and the appendix and some of the other Tolkien history stuff, right?
Yes, the writers and producers of Rings of Power only have rights to The Lord of the Rings, including the Appendix and The Hobbit, but they don't have rights to the Silmarillion, the Peoples of Middle-earth, the Unfinished Tales, and other books. That's probably why they're using a lot of creative freedom.
I see. So, is there anything that you do like about this season so far? The connections that you're making before we go into your thoughts on what doesn't align with Tolkien's world?
Yes, sure. I really liked Cirdan the Shipwright being introduced in this season. He has such an interesting and important role for the elves remaining in Middle-earth, even though he longs to go to Valinor himself. He builds ships so that the elves may set off to the west, and he also has a gift of foresight, a gift from the Valar due to his role. He is also the first to receive any visitors that the Valar send to Middle-earth, like the Istari. So meeting him was really nice. And yes, he does bear Narya, the Ring of Fire, but the whole story about him taking the rings out to sea is all made up by the producers. And yes, Galadriel is the bearer of Nenya, the Ring of Adamant, the Ring of Water. And yes, the High King Gil-galad is the original bearer of Vilya, the Ring of Air. Those are the 3 elves who bear the rings. But in the books, only 3 of them knew who bore the rings. No other elf or man or dwarf knew about who the ring bearers were. No one knew that Círdan bore the ring of fire either, and it was seldom that he used it.
Interesting that it's all secretive in some sense. So I thought Gandalf had a special ring?
Yes, Gandalf had a special ring, the same ring that Círdan the Shipwright has in the Third Age. Gandalf was actually the last of the 5 Istari that the Valar sent to Middle-earth to aid the elves and men against Sauron. Círdan the Shipwright, of course, met him and thought Gandalf was the wisest of all 5 Istari. So he offered Gandalf the Ring of Fire, Narya, to aid him in his quest, that it would kindle the hope in the hearts of those in Middle-earth. And that is how Gandalf eventually receives the ring in the Third Age. But the show is actually taking place in the Second Age before Tolkien introduces Gandalf to Middle-earth.
Okay. I think 95% of that went over my head, but okay. Cool. But what you just said, so can the stranger be Gandalf if Gandalf doesn't show up until the Third Age and the show is taking place in the Second Age? That's confusing.
In my opinion, the stranger can't be Gandalf. Right now in the show, Círdan has the Ring of Fire in the west shores, and the stranger is already far east in Rhûn. In the books, it says that when Gandalf arrives, he meets Círdan and receives the Ring of Fire, but the stranger is already east in the land of Rhûn and doesn't have the Ring of Fire, so he can't be the Gandalf that Tolkien described. But who knows who this stranger is? Definitely one of the Istari. I think he is one of the blue Istari, one of the blue wizards who came early to Middle Earth.
I see. Okay, that's a hot take. All right, so switching gears, One of the questions from our audience was about the elves. What's up with their obsession with the rings? Like, why can't they just go back to Valinor? Why do they want these rings in the first place?
Yes, I think it makes sense for the elves to just leave Middle Earth and go to the most perfect place, Valinor. The show doesn't actually do a good job of explaining why the elves are there in Middle Earth. So, according to Tolkien, the elves are here in Middle Earth because of their pride. They, the Nordor elves, voluntarily exiled themselves because of the three Silmaril jewels,
That's hard to say.
which is another story for another time. But in short, Morgoth, the enemy, took the three Silmarils to Middle Earth, and then Fëanor and his sons swore an oath about the Silmarils. They took all their people to Middle Earth in a gruesome way. But anyway, in Middle Earth, the elves could be kings and queens like the Valar, but without the Valar there. The elves had power and they could reign as the highest race and do what they wanted. So if they go back to Valinor, then they would be the lowest race, be ashamed of having exiled themselves, and admit defeat. That's why they want to stay in Middle Earth.
I see. Okay, so that kind of clears up why they want to stay and why they want the rings to enhance their beauty and preserve their strength, it sounds like. Okay, so their sense of pride is pretty strong.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. Well, here's another question from our listeners. Can you tell us about this black substance that Sauron turns into? And can you tell us who is Morgoth? We thought Sauron was the evil bad guy. And I guess, wow, this is like a four-part question. Can you talk about the whole opening scene, which was super confusing to me specifically?
Honestly, that whole opening scene was so disappointing for me. Sauron is portrayed by Tolkien as a great, terrible servant of Morgoth. To give a brief background, Morgoth is the main evil guy from the First Age. So there are 14 Valar gods and one evil god, and there are many more lesser gods called the Maiar. Some of the Maiar turn evil, like Sauron, and he followed Morgoth. So at the end of the First Age, when Morgoth was defeated, one of the good Maiar, Eonwe, the Herald of Manwë, rebuked Sauron and directed him to return to the Valar, and ask for forgiveness. Sauron did repent, but he was ashamed to go back to Valinor and receive judgment. So when Eonwe departed for Valinor, Sauron hid himself in Middle Earth and fell back into evil. But even if Sauron met with the orcs after Morgoth was defeated, like the first opening scene of the show, season 2, Sauron wouldn't give a weak speech like that. He's really good at speaking and lying and convincing people. The orcs would follow him for sure. And the way that Sauron died in the beginning with that blast of light and blast of wind, turning everything to frost, was kind of strange. But it did remind me of the prologue of the Fellowship of the Ring when Isildur cut the finger off Sauron. There was a flash of light and a blast of wind. There seems to be some connection there from the Peter Jackson films. So that might be where that idea came from.
Interesting.
Now, about the question on Sauron becoming a black substance and preying on animals and people, it was kind of weird for me, but he is kind of, a deceiver and shapeshifter. But that specifically about him being a black substance isn't in the books. In the Tolkien books, Sauron could assume many forms and could appear noble and beautiful so as to deceive all but the most wary. Sauron appeared in the Second Age as Annatar, the Lord of Gifts. Gil-galad and Elrond rejected him. Galadriel rejected him immediately as well. But in Eregion, where many Noldor elves lived, they welcomed him, and because the Noldor elves desired to increase the skill of their works and crafts, they listened to Sauron and learned many things from him. Sauron guided their labors and was aware of all that they did, but the three elven rings were made by Celebrimbor alone and were not touched by Sauron. And Sauron had no idea who had those rings.
Interesting. Okay, that's pretty helpful. Okay, so what was so painful to watch?
All of episode 3 was painful to watch. That daughter of Elendil, I don't even remember her name, and even if I did, I refuse to even acknowledge her.
Whoa.
Her role is just ridiculous. Going against the Queen Regent, going against her father's beliefs, stealing the Palantir that doesn't belong to her. She doesn't even exist in Tolkien's books. Elendil only has 2 sons, Isildur and Anarion. Also, another painful moment was when a woman struck the Queen Regent. I was like, what is that? Like, is this a soap opera like All My Children or something?
Mother, what are you doing here? Murderer!
Yeah, you showed me that clip. Okay, well, I've never seen All of My Children, but I can imagine that it's dramatic with lots of slapping, just like we've just seen in this clip.
And it was so frustrating to watch. The whole story with Ar-Pharazôn being a weird power-hungry man, Queen Muriel being blind, and Isildur battling with a spider. I just couldn't keep watching and I had to take breaks. I forced myself to keep going back so that I could at least finish the episode.
Okay, well, since I slept through most of episode 3 and 1 and 2, what else was so frustrating to watch?
The whole Elven family. So, looking at the House of Noldor and the Sindar Elves and their relationships to one another, according to Tolkien, the show doesn't have things right. To keep this simple and brief for our listeners, I'll say this. Cirdan the Shipwright is the oldest elf on Middle Earth. I agree with the show there, but only there. Then it's Galadriel and Celebrimbor who are the next oldest. They were both in Valinor and saw the light of the 2 trees. Then it's Gil-galad. He's younger than Galadriel. Then it's Elrond. He's the youngest, and eventually he marries Galadriel's daughter. And in the show, Galadriel being younger and being friends with Elrond is just a little weird for me because that's not what I read in the books.
That is super confusing. I think we might need another family tree, just like we did before. And is it possible that maybe just a few thousand years here and there might not be a big deal for the producers of the show?
Not going to answer that question, but
Okay.
the first comment you made, yes, for our listeners out there, if you follow my Instagram, the family tree is on there and on one of the posts.
Okay. Great. Another listener was wondering why Celebrimbor is just so obsessed with making rings.
Of the Noldor elves, Fëanor created the 3 Silmarils. The Silmarils were these beautiful jewels that captured the light of the 2 trees. They were so beautiful and valued highly by the elves. Fëanor is also the guy who came up with the idea to exile themselves to Middle-earth. Anyway, Celebrimbor is Fëanor's grandson, and that is very significant. Celebrimbor wants to also be known as a master craftsman and create something wonderful, beautiful, worthy of everyone's eyes. That's why he was so interested in working with Anatar.
Ah, okay. So there's quite an obsession with jewels, kind of like Thanos from Marvel. Uh, Now that would be an interesting crossover series. But seriously, I just don't understand their obsession with these jewels.
Don't worry, I can explain all of these things through my podcast.
All right, great.
Well, that's all we have for this episode of my podcast. We hope this has piqued your interest into the world of Middle Earth and the Rings of Power.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please leave a rating and a review.
And if you have any questions for us to answer, please DM me or leave a comment on my Instagram at Meenahs_Tirith. Thanks for joining us. Namarie.